Hi, my name is Jake, and I am a bookish drummer. So for today's video, I have another Stephen King for y'all for Stephen King Friday. And for this video, I'm going to be talking about all of the Stephen King books and Richard Bachman books that I read in all of 2022. And good God, I've reread a buttload of Stephen King this year. I'm going to have to count at the end of the video, but I think it's over 40, which is a lot. Like, I've been doing a lot of Stephen King rereading this year, and I'll explain why as we go throughout the video. But hopefully in 2023, even though Stephen King is one of my all-time favorite authors, hopefully I'm going to read severely less Stephen King next year so I can get to all these other books behind me that I haven't read yet. So, you know what? Without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So a lot of these books I can talk about in chunks, and you'll see why as we go along. But the first three books I have to talk about are Night Shift, Skeleton Crew, and Nightmares in Dreamscapes, which we all read for the Stephen King Short Story Book Club. We actually started with Night Shift last year in 2021, but it bled over into January and February of 2022. So we ended up finishing this, and of course, Night Shift is probably my favorite Stephen King short story collection. And then we continued on with Skeleton Crew, which is pretty good, not quite as good as Night Shift. And then, of course, we just wrapped up Nightmares and Dreamscapes, which is still probably my least favorite collection. And then, of course, in 2023, I plan on finishing the other three short story collections. So I will reread those next year. But yeah, those are the three short story collections that we read. The next chunk of books I have to talk about are all not by Stephen King. Well, they are, but they're all Richard Bachman books. And I read all 7 of them, including Rage, which was actually a Patreon book. And I'll get to that later on. But yeah, I read all of the Richard Bachman books, and I buddy read them with my good booktube buddy, Josephina from Fina Reads. We actually did 2 live shows on these 6 Richard Bachman books, and I'll link those links down below. And yeah, most of these Richard Bachman books are very good, except for Rage. I really don't like that one. But yeah, I read all of the Richard Bachman books. The Long Walk is pretty good. We got Roadwork, which is my favorite. We've got The Running Man, which is pretty good, but not near my favorite. Thinner, which is very good. The Regulators, just a lot of fun. And then Blaze is probably my second favorite. And then, like I said, Rage is my least favorite. And the next chunk of books I have to talk about are 8 books, and some of them are quite chunky. You can probably guess what I'm talking about as I'm struggling to get a hold of them. It is, of course, the Dark Tower series. I reread the Dark Tower in its entirety all this year, and of course I started with the Gunslinger, and the plan was to read 1 a month and finish up in August, but there was a couple of months where I got kind of burnt out on King and the Dark Tower, so I actually ended up finishing the Dark Tower in October during, of course, the Stephen King readathon. But I did finish the Dark Tower in its entirety. Still one of my all-time favorite series. Of course, you got the Gunslinger, which is much better on reread. I think that's the 3rd time I've read it now. Drawing of the Three, my all-time favorite Dark Tower book. Wastelands, probably a close second. You've also got Wizard in Glass, which I actually liked a little less the second time around, but still overall very good. You got Wind Through the Keyhole, which is fine. Probably my least favorite overall. And then you've got Wolves of the Kala, which is my least favorite novel out of like the main series. It's still good though. It's like 3 stars. Song of Susanna, 4.5 stars. Severely underrated. I love Song of Susanna. And then you got Dark Tower, which is the final book in the magnum opus. I liked it a little less. I gave it 3.5 stars the second time around. Still a fantastic ending, but a lot of anticlimactic moments. But I'm still glad I gave The Dark Tower a second, well, not given a second shot, but given a reread, because it is one of my all-time favorite series. I also read a trilogy of books. Some of these were co-written by King. One of them was not written by King at all, but I figured I'd go ahead and talk about them as a whole. Of course, I'm talking about the Gwendy trilogy. Gwendy's Button Box, one of his best novellas of all time. Gwendy's Magic Feather, which was solely written by Richard Chizmar. I really did not have a good time with this one. 2 stars. And then, of course, the third and final book, Gwendy's Final Task, which came out earlier this year. It was slightly better than Magic Feather, but still overall not very good. I probably will never reread these two, but Button Box is still very good, even though it is kind of tainted by these 2 other books. And I read those this year. These next chunk of Stephen King books all have something in common, and that's because they were all picked by my Patreons for me to read in 2022, and I'll go over them, but basically they all got to vote on which Stephen King book I got to read every month, and the winner, I read the book and I did a book review for it. And so the very first one was The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. Very fun reread. I liked it much better the second time, reading it as an adult. And then Duma Key, one of my all-time favorite Stephen King books. Top 10, definitely. Top 5, maybe. But yeah, I had a blast reading it a second time. Desperation, again, I think I liked it better the second time around. The first time was meh, or the second time, pretty good. I still like The Regulators more, which is the companion novel written by Richard Bachman. And then Carrie, again, one of my all-time favorite King books. I think it's great. Maybe slightly underrated. I know some people have problems with it, but I think it's still one of the best debut novels of all time. And then, of course, Rage, which I talked about earlier. Patrick made me read it, even though I told him one of my least favorites. Still one of my least favorites, and I don't like it. Also, Mr. Mercedes. Pretty good, although I like the sequel a bit more. This one is still pretty good. Needful Things, fantastic book. Probably now jumping into my top 10, at least top 15. But yeah, Needful Things is just awesome. And then one that I read in October during the Stephen King Readathon has now jumped into my top 10, probably. I keep saying that, but I can only fit 10 books in the top 10. But anyway, I digress. Dolores Claiborne was the last one for the Patreon winner, and I had a blast listening to the audiobook. The audiobook, I think, is what jumped it up to like being top tier King. Dolores Claiborne, 5 stars. Also, earlier this year, I was busy ranking all of Stephen King's novellas. So for a lot of them, I had to go back and reread them just to like refresh my memory on them and just to see if they were as good as I remember them being. So I reread most of these novella collections. Of course, you know, they're out of order here. We got Different Seasons, which is his first one. 4 Past Midnight, I think I read a couple of them and kind of refreshed my memory on them. It's probably my least favorite novella collection. It's got The Langoliers and Secret Window, Secret Garden, which are both pretty good. But it also has The Library Policeman and The Sundog, which I think are a little bit boring. Also, going back to Different Seasons, top 5 Stephen King book of all time. A perfect novella collection. I love it. And we've got Full Dark, No Stars. Again, Stephen King most of the time does novellas very well, and this is a clear example. Full Dark, No Stars. Definitely a fitting title. A lot of dark novellas. They're all great. And then If It Bleeds, probably my second favorite out of all of these. Just is perfect, and yeah, that's just some fantastic novella. So yeah, like I said, for the novella ranking that I did, I ended up having to reread a lot of them. And of course, Stephen King had a new big release come out, and I was excited, just like a lot of other people. Even though when we ended up reading it, most of us, I would say, in this corner of Discord and YouTube, didn't have a great time with it. Although a few people loved it, I was not one of them. Of course, I'm talking about Fairy Tale, which came out in September, and it starts out great. Its first 200 pages or so are excellent. Once it gets to the actual like portal parts, like the portal fantasy stuff, it falls off a cliff and it's not very good. Which is sad to say though. I ended up giving this like 3 stars, maybe even retroactively 2.5 stars. Probably not a book I'm going to reread anytime soon, unfortunately. And the next chunk of books are all books that I read throughout the year. A lot of them were done in October, of course, for the Stephen King readathon. So let's go ahead and talk about them. I think they're all in publication order, if I have them correct here. Of course, the first one is The Dead Zone, my all-time favorite Stephen King book. Very fun reread, and glad to say that it's still my all-time favorite. Love The Dead Zone. Cujo, very fun reread too. Read it in October. I get why people don't love it, but I love it, so suck it. And then also Pet Sematary, which I also have a book review for, even though it wasn't for Patreon. I felt the need to give my unpopular opinions for this book because I have some significant problems with it, even though it is a good book. It's certainly not a great book. I think it's one of his most overrated. I also read Eyes of the Dragon, which was a very fun reread. This was actually one of the first Stephen King books I read way back in high school, I believe. I think it was pretty good then, but also pretty good now. I also reread The Dark Half, which I actually liked slightly less than the first time I read it. It got a little repetitive for me. I love the premise and how goofy it is, but a little repetitive, but still very good. I also reread On Writing, which of course is a very fun listen if you get the audio, because of course it's half memoir, half writing advice from Stephen King himself. So it was a very fun listen, pretty good. I reread Cell because a few people were reading it and they're like, oh, it's actually kind of good. So I was like, oh, maybe I'm misremembering something. But I went back and reread it and was quite bored with most of it. It had some good parts to it, but overall, still quite boring. I also reread The Colorado Kid, which is more of a novella and probably Stephen King's most underrated book and story. I love it. I give it 5 stars. Most people hate it or think it's just forgettable or they hate the ending. I love it. And then, of course, we have Revival, which one of my favorite rereads of the year because, again, like with a couple of the books I've reread, it quickly shot up into my top 10, top 15. This book is just incredible. And knowing what's coming sort of makes it better in a way because you can kind of see all the foreshadowing that King does and you just know where everything is leading to and you're just like, oh man, this is and it's just definitely one of the most brutal endings and just one of the most nihilistic things. It's really good and it's awesome. We also have Finders Keepers, which is the sequel to Mr. Mercedes, and I wish this would have just been a standalone. Like, this book could have been a 5-star book if this was just not related to Bill Hodges and the gang at all. Like, the story itself is so compelling. And then Bill Hodges and company comes in, and they're fine, but it should have just been a standalone. But yeah, 4.5-star book, excellent. And I believe the last book I have to talk about, if I'm not forgetting anything, which I probably am, but oh well, that would be Later. Again, I read this for the Stephen King readathon. Very quick, almost novella length, but a short novel. Very good, very fun premise. Not perfect. I think this was my first Stephen King book review, and I was just excited. I gave it 5 stars. It's more of like a 4.5-star book now. but still, it's excellent. And I believe that's it. So that's all of the Stephen King rereads I've done in 2022. All right, so what did you guys think of my video today? What did you guys think of all of the Stephen King that I managed to read and reread in the year 2022? Out of all of these books, what is your favorite? What is your least favorite? And I know I said that I'm not really going to reread too much Stephen King, but if you had to choose one for me to reread next year, just one, what would it be? Leave your comments down in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the YouTube channel and the Bookish Charmer Discord. Also, I have my Patreon page if you want to support me there. And I have my Amazon wish list if any of y'all would like to buy me a book. Thank you guys so much for watching and have a fantastic day.